one of the underrated elements of Springsteen is Springsteen as a, for lack of a better word, manager.
Yes.
Like, I think that part of the reason that both E Street and the other band have been so great over time is that he kind of can look at a group of people, listen to their tapes, and see where their strengths are and help build a band that capitalizes on that stuff. So there's an element of him just kind of willing them to greatness, and I think there's also an element of like, these are very talented musicians, and that's
Right.
why they get picked out by Bruce Springsteen.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson, and today we are talking Bruce, but we also are talking greatest movie ever made. He says with italics, maybe question mark. Joining me in a return engagement. Russ was here last July. Russ, Burlingame, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. As I was saying to you off mic, I've been wanting to come back, but I'm the kind of neurotic who doesn't feel welcome unless I have a reason.
Well, I want you to know, I say this officially, anytime you just even come up with, hey, I have this random wild blank thought about Bruce or music. Jesse, can I join the show? So
I,
you're always welcome.
what's funny is I every so often I do, and I always try to figure out, is there a way for me to retrofit this for my day job? Can I turn
Yeah,
this into a comicbook.com story somehow?
yeah, absolutely. So you're always welcome to join me. So for those of you who came late in the spirit of the fandom, tell us a little about yourself.
I'm an entertainment journalist. For the last 20 years, I've been writing about the geek space. And so right now, I'm on year 11 of working for comicbook.com. And if you've heard of us, it was probably in the last few years as we've gotten like huge. I've been there since there was 13,000 people reading, and nobody, you would tell them the name and they'd be like, "Oh, so you draw comics?"
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
which I don't. I'm a reporter who covers that industry and adjacent media, which, for me, adjacent media is I cover a lot of the Arrowverse shows and stuff like that. I'm a
Hmm.
TV writer primarily,
Hmm.
and I like to dip back into comics as often as I can because I love them.
Yeah.
But I've been a Springsteen fan on the one hand, like as long as I can remember, because growing up, my dad had the tapes in the car all the time. I think I told you last time. I remember thinking as a kid that "For You" was like a wildly successful song because
Sure.
it was a song that was just on all the time and it was really catchy. Uh, and so like I remembered thinking like that was a huge that was Springsteen's big hit. Uh, which in 1984 probably was not a widely held conception by anybody. Uh, but so I've been around his music my whole life, but I really became a hardcore fan when he did the MTV Plugged show, which of course is ironic because it means that when I took the next step into my like super fandom, it was with the Scab Band.
Yeah.
um,
But
but it was just timing. Like
it
I was that
was.
age.
I just I, I just was talking to Peter Chanka yesterday. Does Blogness on the Edge of Town, and um, my most successful episode
Hmm.
by like 50% downloads is when Peter joined me to talk about Human Touch in Lucky Town.
Nice.
By far. I mean, you're like, why? What about that? And Russ, what's interesting is over the past probably 3 or 4 months, I've had people on that talk about their first show was the other band,
Hmm.
or how much they said, I know they get short shift, but that was actually a pretty solid tour. And that
Yeah.
was a pretty good band. I mean, I know and they all kind of say, I know that's kind of, heresy, but, and to mix our sports metaphors, right? It's almost like, like when LeBron joins a team and wills them to the finals, it's like
Yeah.
Bruce took this other group and willed them to just be amazing,
Yeah.
which is kind of funny. But yes, I love.
Although I will say to a certain extent, there's also the element of like one of the underrated elements of Springsteen is Springsteen as a, for lack of a better word, manager.
Yes.
Like I think that part of the reason that both E Street and the other band have been so great over time is that he kind of can look at a group of people, listen to their tapes, and see where their strengths are and help build a band that capitalizes on that stuff. So there's an element of him just kind of willing them to greatness, and I think there's also an element of like these are very talented musicians, and that's
Right.
why they get picked out by Bruce Springsteen.
You know, and I think a good sign of that is when they're doing the sign request, right?
Mm-hmm.
That he's able to, especially when it was the E Street Band on steroids or the E Street Orchestra, right? When they were doing the Wrecking Ball
Yeah.
and High Hopes, where you had the horns and the backup singers, that they were able to get all these different pieces, from a sign request.
Yeah.
So that's pretty crazy. Um, all right. Hey, let's do a Springsteen quick hits.
All right.
Um, so Letter to You. Your thoughts? It's been almost 6 months now since we've had it.
Yeah.
What's your
I
thoughts?
loved it. I think it's what's funny about Letter to You for me is that it went the opposite way that Western Stars did for me,
Hmm.
which is with Western Stars, it took me a bit to kind of totally warm up to it. Like I thought it was a good album, but it wasn't tickling my spirit.
Yeah.
And so like for the first few months, I would listen to it sporadically, and then like eventually something clicked, and I was like, okay, yeah. And then I was really into it for a while after that. With Letter to You, it was kind of the opposite. It was like I immediately connected with it emotionally. I love the record. And then I kind of played it to death. And now, in the time since those first couple of months, I've been playing it with less frequency, mostly just because I feel like I burned a hole in the record.
Yeah. No, I get that. Yeah.
But it's funny because it was the opposite, exactly the opposite of the previous studio record, and that
That's
kind
kind
of
of
thing
funny.
always, yeah.
Did you get to see the documentary on Apple?
I did, but I was exhausted that night, and I was
Okay.
in and out of consciousness.
Okay.
I will say the bits that I remember, it strikes me as I like what Zimney does with these films, but as like a movie guy,
Hmm.
I feel like they always, even the features, they always still kind of feel like bonus material on a DVD.
Interesting.
Like,
That's not. I can see that point. Yeah.
and
That's interesting.
I think part of that is like inevitable because
Hmm.
when you have somebody who's employed by Thrill Hill
Hmm.
doing these things, it becomes like, well, you're gonna toe the company line because that's what you're there to do.
Yeah.
And I don't think that there's anybody who would make a documentary about the making of a Springsteen record and not be a fan.
Sure.
But I feel like there's a difference between being a fan and being an employee.
Yeah.
Um, and so I thought it was really well done. I think he's a very talented editor and filmmaker.
Yeah.
But it always feels just a little bit at a remove to me, like almost
Okay.
sterile in a way that like
Interesting. Okay.
bonus features tend to feel to me. And I can't put my finger on why, but like every time one of these things comes out and it's him, I'm just like, oh, so I know already what it's gonna kind of look and sound like.
When when the Jeep ad came out, I at first thought it was fake. And from because you're in the fandom the way I am,
Hmm.
you know, there are a lot of creative fans out there that will take
Yeah,
outtakes and things and will build trailers from movies that don't exist,
yeah,
Doctor Who episodes that don't exist. And
yeah.
so this looked so much like a outtakes from Western Stars.
It
I
really
was like,
did. Yeah,
is this a fake? Did some really good fan, piece this
yeah.
together? Um, so I gotta get your thought. The Jeep ad, any hot Springsteen opinions?
It was a weird one for me because like
Okay.
I definitely I can appreciate what he's trying to do there.
Yeah.
Um, but it did kind of feel like this is the first time that you hear Bruce uh, doing his boundless optimism thing. Usually, when he's doing that, when he's talking about the charting the distance between the American dream and American reality, he has a way of making it sound accessible to everybody.
Yeah.
And in the Jeep ad, he really sounded like a 70-year-old white guy for the first time.
Yeah.
Like
I think that's a fair thought.
and it's not that what he was saying wasn't valid. It's just that for whatever reason, the tone and the visuals and the everything, like it just felt like it didn't feel as earnest as Bruce usually is, which is funny because the words that are being spoken are some of the most overly earnest things that have ever come out of his mouth. But it kind of felt calculated and commercial and all the things that a commercial is, because that's how it works.
Yeah.
But I feel like you almost missed an opportunity. It's like you have this guy who is a natural storyteller, who is a natural he is an inspirational speaker and an inspirational figure. And so I almost feel like what happened there is that somebody wrote trying to sound like Bruce Springsteen instead of just letting Bruce into the writer's room.
What I found interesting is, and I don't remember who tweeted this, but showing the diversity of the extreme left and the extreme right reactions to the ad tells you how far away from the middle we are as a society, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Like how can one thing tick off both sides so much?
Yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, part of that honestly is the and I'm like, I don't want to get into the actual politics of it, but part of the answer for that is literally just the idea that for a lot of people on both sides of the political aisle in this country, the notion of trying to appeal to everybody is inherently flawed because they think the other side's evil. There's a chunk of people on the right and a chunk of people on the left who are both going to be like, you. But there's an element of that that's going to be inevitably, it's going to make people upset. And again, I don't really like, you could have a whole separate conversation about whether getting upset about something like that is a valid perspective or not, but that's just reality. I don't think it's necessarily the content as it was the overall message of like trying to get along that upset a lot of people on the fringes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the idea, where was this look for the middle when Trump was president? And how dare you ask me to go to the middle on someone who doesn't want people to vote, that are racist, that, so it's crazy.
Well, and I will say, as kind of a button on the Jeep conversation, the overwhelming thought that I was left with wasn't necessarily overly positive or overly negative, but it was after 50 years of never having done a commercial, this is the one he picks.
Yeah.
Like that seemed so, like it seems like such a weird choice. And I feel like maybe it's just he felt like in this moment, that was the time, and it was less about the ad than about the moment.
I think so. And I think it is Betsy Hodges was on the podcast, and she was talking about, I think they offered him, as she said, I think they offered him a lot of money to talk about something that he believes in. And so therefore he was able to do it and find it. One last Springsteen talk, and then we're going to go to our discussion about your Indiegogo project. Are you enjoying the Springsteen and Barack Obama conversations?
I am, with a slight asterisk, which is only that because I have read Obama's books and I have listened to Bruce my whole life. It's a very entry level podcast on some levels.
Yes.
Like there's a lot of these conversations. It's like I've heard both halves of this. It's kind of like Bruce and Obama are just like bouncing their aphorisms back and forth at each other. And they're both very intelligent, very articulate sets of aphorisms. But it's all stuff that if you know these men, you have heard before. And so I think that the best elements of it are the moments when when they get deep enough into the conversation that they're not talking philosophy anymore, that you see the humanity of these two guys
Yeah.
talking. And then you'll get things like where Obama asks him like a direct question
Yeah.
about Clarence, or a
Yeah.
direct question about, and that's when the good stuff tends to come out, because first of all, it gives Bruce a chance to say something that isn't something he said in 14 interviews,
Right.
but also it provides you a really sharp insight into what it is that is important to President Obama
Mhm.
about Bruce and the music, and what it is they're
Yeah.
talking about. I find it curious that they essentially set it up. It feels like Obama interviewing Springsteen. That's what the show feels like. And I'm almost like, logically you would think it would be Springsteen interviewing Obama, because
Yeah.
like Obama was a president of the United States. Um, but there's no real perfect way to do it, because they are both very good storytellers. And I
Yes.
think that no matter who you put in the position of being the guy who's just asking questions, that person's going to get kind of the short shrift.
Yeah.
And
And
so I think probably what happened is that because Obama is a huge Springsteen fan, he was just like, no, this is the way I want to do it.
well, and I do think that you do have some of those where, Springsteen's like, "Tell me the Amazing Grace story. How
Yeah.
did that happen?" And the talking about, I do. One of the things I love, and I don't know how much of that is shtick, but the idea that Michelle Obama connecting to Patty, and
Mm-hmm.
like the wives, like, okay, they bonded, and okay, you need to spend more time with this guy, right? Like,
Yeah.
because he
Yeah.
seems it, and it does seem like they have a good friendship. I saw
Yeah.
somebody complaining that it shouldn't be called Renegades, and they're, all this stuff. I think that's marketing. I think the idea
Yeah.
is you have two very smart and popular people talking,
Yeah.
and it's pretty fun.
Yeah. And I think too that like any title you pick for it, somebody's going to be pedantic and say, well, that
Yeah.
doesn't work. I feel like probably they wanted it to just be called Born in the USA. And
Mhm.
then Bruce sold his song catalog, and you run into some issues of having to compensate somebody for that. um, that'd be my guess. Maybe
Mhm.
I'm wrong.
No, no,
Uh,
you could be. All right. You have a project going on.
I do.
So let's talk
I'm
a little bit about this.
Sure thing. I'm writing a book, and it isn't about Springsteen, but it does definitely involve popular music. And it's called Best Movie Ever: An Oral History of Alphonse and Kaplan's Josie and the Pussycats. Now, people who were kind of alive and cognizant in 2001, which is basically anybody over 30 probably, uh, will probably remember that Josie and the Pussycats came out that year and was a bomb at the theaters. Uh, my book kind of traces from the development and production of the movie through it becoming a cult classic. Because on the internet, it's now found uh, a very embracing audience, and you'll get things like special screenings where people show up in cosplay and sing at the screen like Rocky Horror. Um,
So one of the things I think first is, I was a big fan of Kevin Pollock's chat show,
mhm.
and I think he really did some really good long form interviews. Talk about that would be interesting. Him interviewing Bruce,
Yeah,
because he seems to do. Um, but I remember him saying, "No one tries to make a crappy movie."
yeah,
Right, understand that. So, when we talked and I saw your campaign, I immediately reached out to you. Hey, Russ, do you need some help promoting it? And you said that would be
mhm,
great. So I had never watched the movie.
mhm.
Just,
Right.
you
And
know,
so probably like 90% of everybody, you figured like the reason that it bombed was because it was a terrible adaptation of a 70s cartoon.
yeah. So I last weekend my wife was out of town, and I had to I needed to watch some Doctor Who episodes because I'm going to talk about them on the Doctor Who podcast.
Mhm.
And I had, on the Amazon Fire Stick, I put Josie and the Pussycats in there, and I pull it up, and I'm like, oh, that was funny. Oh, that was good. Oh, this is pretty good. Wow, that music's actually pretty decent. And I ended up truly enjoying the movie. Not, oh, it's so bad it's good. I'm like,
Yeah.
this is one of those, and this will show you how old I am.
Mhm.
Every once in a while, you would go to Blockbuster. None of the new releases were out. You'd pick up a VHS because, well, let's try it, and you
Yeah.
go, wow, that was unexpectedly nice. Wow, I'm
Yeah.
glad we found that.
Well,
Go ahead.
it's funny that you say that that tells you how old you are, because that's kind of the premise of our video store podcast,
Yeah,
is this idea that like that's missing now, because first of all, nothing's ever out of stock. And
right.
secondly, even when you're browsing, it's a whole different animal browsing in a world
Yeah.
where all of the thumbnails look exactly the same because that's how marketing has decided they looked,
Yes.
versus walking through a store where it's like not all VHS tapes look the same, and even if they do have the same marketing look, like that marketing look is going to be spread out over 25 years, and there's going to be different,
Yeah.
and so like that idea is actually something that I think about a lot, and
Yeah.
that's something we do talk about a little bit in the book. As
Hmm.
I spoke to a guy who used to manage a Blockbuster
Hmm.
about how this movie performed on home video after it bombed at the box office.
Yeah.
Because when I spoke to there's so I talked to cast, crew, experts, and then fans. And the chunk on fans, a lot of it is just talking to people who fell in love with this movie and saying like, okay, so when did you fall in love with this movie? When did you realize that it was a flop? When
Hmm.
did you realize that it had developed this cult following?
Yeah.
And trying to track like, okay, so how did this happen? Because like one of the things I find really interesting about Josie is that it's one of the very first of kind of a new generation of cult classics that had to find its audience organically, often on the internet.
Yeah.
Because when you look at something like Tremors bombed at the box office, but then it was the number one most rented movie in 1991.
Okay.
And so it made so much money on tape that immediately they were like, okay, sequel.
Right.
And, Mallrats uh, bombed at the box office, but then was a huge renter. And Universal never really appreciated it in the way that fans did. But at the same time, Kevin Smith continued to be a hot commodity. It didn't hurt his career in the way that
Yes.
Josie and the Pussycats really hurt Harry Elfont and Deb Kaplan's career. They did this movie coming off of Can't Hardly Wait. And everybody's like, oh, the Can't Hardly Wait guys, we want them forever. And
Hmm.
then they never did another feature film after Josie.
Wow.
I mean, they've written feature films and they've done a lot of TV. They show run right now a show called Liza on Demand, which is on YouTube, which is really funny.
Okay.
But this was their last feature film, and it's funny because in the commentary track for the movie, they they recorded the commentary track after the movie bombed,
Okay.
and so there is a joke in the commentary track where Harry says like, "Oh, we should do this next," and Deb's like, "You think they're ever going to let us make another movie?"
Yeah.
And it's just like, ooh.
How funny, and sad. So, um, it's and if you haven't seen the movie, I don't want to spoil it, but it's a clever plot.
Mhm.
Um, Amazing cast. I
Yeah, the
mean, when
cast is really.
I mean, like, you know,
It's Rachel Lee Cook is Josie, and then the
mhm,
other two Pussycats are Tara Reid and Rosario Dawson. When I think those three, a lot of people who remember that the movie exists would be
mhm,
able to identify those three because they were all the posters.
yeah,
But like the villains were Alan Cumming and Parker Posey, who had
yeah.
just worked together on the anniversary party like 5 minutes before. And
Well, and
then,
so one of the things I did
mhm,
during the lockdown is I had not watched the new Lost in Space reboot,
yeah,
and so I caught that up during this lockdown. And I went, "Oh my God, Parker Posey is amazing
oh yeah,
as Dr. Smith, right?" And then Alan Cumming. I'm just a huge fan of, regardless. I mean,
yeah,
he is, he was amazing in The Good Wife. He's just, anything he does is amazing. And when I see him, I'm like, oh wow, that's a
yeah.
really cool.
It's
Uh,
funny. He did an unaired TV pilot based
Hmm.
on one of my very favorite movies. This thing called Zero Effect,
Okay.
and originally it was Ben Stiller and Bill Pullman. It's like a riff on Sherlock Holmes,
Okay.
but it whereas most Holmes riffs focus on the genius part of his like tortured, drug-addled
Hmm.
genius. Zero Effect kind of focuses on the tortured part of his tortured,
Okay.
drug-addled genius, and so they made this movie. I loved it. It made its budget back, but it was like a $2.5 million movie. It was never gonna be a huge hit. Ironically, the writer director Jake Kasdan has since gone on to do the new Jumanji movies, which are huge hits.
Hmm.
Um, but so they made a TV pilot based on Zero Effect. The idea was that CBS, I think, at one point wanted to have it as a TV show,
Okay.
and Alan Cumming got cast as the main character, as Daryl Zero.
Okay.
And so during my interview with Alan for the book, one of the things that I did was I included Zero Effect in a list with like X-Men and some other stuff of like the franchises he was doing at the time. And so I, for the first time ever, in his like native accent, I actually heard Alan Cumming say the words Zero Effect, and I'm just like, there's something funny about this to me. Like,
That's yeah. Um. So the other thing that I found very interesting is in a lot of ways the subplot of the film is how modern entertainment, TV's film, music
mhm,
drives consumerism.
yeah, yeah, and
And
vice versa.
yes, and there is, and you shocked me when you told this, there is product placement throughout the movie. I mean,
Yeah,
not subtle product placement, but
no,
like,
it's the word would be pervasive, I
yeah,
think.
like when there's two characters talking and in the back on the wall is Reeboks or,
Yeah,
something. It is just, and you
each
said,
each of the three girls, their hotel room was themed to a different brand. So
yes,
like when you were in Josie's room, it was, I think, some cosmetic company, and I'm blanking on it
yeah,
at the moment. Clinique maybe.
okay,
But then like in Val's room, Rosario Dawson's room, everything was Target. And so
yes,
you get a scene where she's having a very emotional moment and she's very sad, and the like pillow essentially that she's hugging to her chest isn't a pillow, it's the Target dog.
yes,
um,
yeah.
uh,
And you said none of that was paid for.
no, none of that was paid for, which it actually was one of the key misunderstandings of a lot of the early reviews. A lot of reviews would be like, how can you have a movie that's all about criticizing product placement, but it's packed with product placement? And the answer is like, that, well, A, that it wasn't paid for, but B, the directors intentionally made the decision. Like they talked about it at first, they're like, do
Hmm.
we do like Morley cigarettes and Duff beer, or do we get
Hmm.
permission to use the AOL logo?
Yeah.
And they went with real brands because they thought that the commentary would be muted
Hmm.
if it was all pretend brands,
Yeah.
because it's not asking anybody to confront uncomfortable truths about the things that they're comfortable with.
Hmm.
you know it's like you can make Duff beer evil
Right.
and it doesn't change anybody's day-to-day life.
Right. Who wrote
uh,
the music?
the music was written by like a writer's room.
Okay.
uh, the Adam Schlesinger from Fountains of Wayne, who recently passed away due to COVID,
Hmm.
was the guy who did their main single that you see in the musical montage in the movie.
Okay.
Um,
Very
the
talented guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The record was produced partially by Schlesinger and partially by Kenny Babyface Edmonds, because what happened was Babyface was the producer on the record until they realized that they hadn't recorded enough music to fill a whole soundtrack record.
Hmm.
And so they went back and recorded like an extra 5 tracks or something with Schlesinger producing.
Hmm.
Jane Weedland from the Go-Go's was one of the songwriters. There was a guy called Dave Gibbs who was one of the songwriters. Um, there was like 5 or 6 people who were in this writers' room, and then also Harry and Deb, the directors, were involved actively with some of the songwriting.
Hmm.
I know that Harry and Deb were the ones who wrote all the lyrics for the Du Jour songs, which Du
Okay.
Jour is the boy band that appears in the movie. It's essentially like a lampoon of NSYNC,
Okay.
right down to having the music video in the airplane tarmac. or the airport tarmac, excuse me. Um, but their songs are like the most parodic of the movie. They're the ones that feel like we're actively poking fun at these things.
Hmm.
Whereas the Josie songs, by and large, like they feel dated because they were made in 2001, but they're like legitimately good kind of pop punk songs, like mall punk kind
Yeah.
of, if you like that kind of music, I think it would be hard not to like the record.
Yeah.
If you actively disdain that kind of music, you probably wouldn't like it, but that's just genre, not quality. um, but they were all performed by Letters to Cleo's Kay Hanley,
Okay.
um, with a bunch of session musicians that included Schlesinger and some others.
So let's talk about your campaign. Um, what are you trying to accomplish? You were going to write a book,
Yeah.
but you're asking for a little bit of help, correct?
Yeah, I'm crowdfunding essentially the production costs of the book, and there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, I have a couple of like boutique publishers who are interested, but because they're smaller publishers, the book needs to basically be done, so I can hand it to them and be like, okay, publish this.
Yes.
Um, which means certain costs like paying for a professional editor, paying to get all these dozens and dozens of hours of interviews transcribed, paying for somebody to design the look of the book, like the actual book, the pages, the
Yes.
font, and all that. These are things that somebody has to pay for. And so basically, what I'm doing is I'm telling people, like, look, I've got 80% of my interviews done already. Uh, if I were to stop what I'm doing right now and just put together a draft, it would still be the most exhaustive look at Josie and the Pussycats that has ever existed. Minus maybe there was a podcast last year called Josie and the Podcats by an Australian DJ and author named Maria Lewis, and it's terrific. And one of my big challenges actually has been telling the story in a comprehensive way without copying what she did.
Okay.
Like it's tough because like you get certain things where it's just like, I need an expert on Archie comics. I
Hmm.
don't want to use the same expert on Archie comics that she used, but there's only a certain number of experts on
Exactly.
Archie
Yes.
comics. And so little things like that. And I also just a peek into how the sausage is made on something like this. You always want new stuff. You always want new anecdotes. You want to
Right.
unearth things that haven't previously come out. Um, and so when I was talking to the directors, we talked for almost 2 hours, and I got a lot of good stuff that nobody had ever heard before. But as I was starting to assemble things, I realized like, oh, I was so focused on getting new, interesting content. I didn't ask them like the things that all the hardcore fans already know.
Right.
So like Beyonce Knowles auditioned for the movie,
Okay.
and the directors have kind of a well-worn anecdote about her audition and how she was very polite, she was very quiet, she sat in the middle of the floor when she was doing her audition. um, and like I didn't get that quote because like I've heard it so many times that my brain was like, okay, we can move past that. But it's like, no, I need to go back, and in my wrap-up interview I need to get them to tell me
Yes.
like the greatest hits stories, so to speak,
Yeah.
like the
That
things
makes
they've told
sense.
everybody.
Yeah.
But in any event, so if I were to stop what I'm doing now, it would be probably the deepest anybody has ever gone into this movie by a decent margin, and it would be a really fun, readable book.
Hmm.
Um, but so that's the level of completion I'm at. But I'm basically telling people like pre-order because I know there's going to be a book. Like even if I had had to go out of pocket to just make a small paperback run, it would have happened.
Yeah.
Um, that's not going to happen now because the numbers that I had to hit in order to pay my editor and the guy who's designing the book actually has still not given me an amount other than that he wants a pair of prop headphones from the movie.
Okay.
Um, I have a small collection of props from Josie and the Pussycats, and most of them I put up for sale as part of the crowdfunding campaign. Um,
What about this? What? Because I'm kind of doing what you did. I'm immediately going to the mechanics, but what about this movie drove you to, you know what? I think this story needs to be told.
it's a few things. First of all, I watched the movie when it came out and I enjoyed it, but I hadn't thought about it in years. And then I was watching, I was on Reddit, and Rachel Lee Cook was doing some AMA for some other project. I don't know what. And somebody like directed her like, oh, you should check out this thread. It's all about how much like people love Josie and the Pussycats now. This was like 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so like Rachel dropped what she was doing and went and like personally thanked a bunch of people in this Josie and the Pussycats thread to be like, man, we're really proud of that movie. I'm really glad that it's finding an audience because like at the time nobody watched it. And I thought that's like really cool, really classy thing to do. I should watch that movie again sometime. And so I watched the movie again and I was like, man, there was a lot more in here that I didn't pick up on when I was like 21 and watching because Rachel Lee Cook is cute, you know?
Yes.
And so it was one of the two movies we talked about in the first episode of the Emerald City Video podcast when we started that 5 years ago or whatever it was. And so basically since then I've had this idea that like there's something there. Like, and part of this is honestly just because I work in the entertainment media. And if you want to know basically anything about the Avengers movie,
right,
you can find it out. Because the combination of like every molecule of every tentpole movie being covered to death by 100 different entertainment sites and everybody having social media and everybody having camera phones and every, you know, it's like these things are like the demand that fans have always had to know more and see more and have more of their favorite movie or favorite record or whatever. Now it's more or less satisfied.
right.
Like we no longer have to wait for the 30th anniversary reissue of Born to Run to get a documentary about the making of like no, Letter to You, it came out the same day as the record.
Yes.
You know. And so as a reporter who like that's what I do. I help become part of this white noise that covers everything to death. I thought this is a good movie. There's a lot of really cool people in it. There's got to be some good stories here. And so years ago, I started kind of half-heartedly putting together notes for like, what if I did a book? What if I did an oral history? What if I did like whatever? And at the time, I backed off because they were releasing the soundtrack record on vinyl for the first time. And the press release for the thing said, and included in the record is an oral history of the movie. And I was like, oh, somebody's doing it. Great. So I buy the record and the interviews they had in there were terrific, but it was like 14 pages. And it was basically Harry, Deb, Rachel, and nobody else. And they didn't really talk about the production of the movie. They glanced at it, but they really mostly talked about the phenomenon of how it became a cult classic and also about the soundtrack. And so I was like, okay, well, that was cool, but it's not what I thought it was going to be. So I started potentially gathering plans again to maybe do one. And then I heard that Josie and the Podcasts was happening. And I was like, okay, well, it's a niche property. I didn't want to step on anybody's toes because like there's only so many people who are going to buy a book about this. And so like this is the third kind of iteration of me being like, okay, I want to do a Josie and the Pussycats book. But it remains basically two big elements. One is, like I said, I think that there's stories to be told, which if the movie was made now, we would be hearing all the time.
Yeah.
And then two, that narrative that they did in that initial oral history really is interesting. Like this notion of something that was widely regarded as a flop. Suddenly, like having everybody do these like retrospect, it's not just like people on Twitter. Like if you Google Josie and the Pussycats, one of the first things that comes up is a story from the LA Times that says Josie and the Pussycats was way ahead of its time.
Okay.
And like the LA Times is a paper that gave it a terrible review at the time, but years later they kind of look back on it and they're just like, oh, we see what they were doing. Yeah. And so I think there's a really interesting narrative arc to that. Like there's a really interesting narrative arc to this idea that we can later on realize that we misunderstood something as a culture. And then also, honestly, there's a weird element to Josie that isn't there for a lot of other movies, which is, I think part of the reason it took so long to become a quote unquote cult classic is because the idea of cult classics itself is very gendered. Fight Club comes out in 1999 and by 2000 it's a cult classic. But like it takes a lot longer for something like Josie, and I think a lot of that is because when you just say cult classic, most of the movies you think of skew heavily male, with the exception of maybe Rocky Horror,
Yeah.
you know. And so I think that there's an element of that too that's interesting to look at, like the idea that this is a movie. It's not really overtly feminist, but it did come out as part of this like pop feminist wave of movies that included Charlie's Angels and Spice World and a bunch of stuff like that, and Coyote Ugly even.
Yeah.
And
So go ahead, Russ. I'm sorry.
but so like there's all of these different kind of pieces that I think are really interesting, and like part of the idea of the book is taking these and putting them together and seeing if they fit or if they're just kind of interesting things that exist.
So if someone wants to help and wants an early copy of the book, how do they get it?
Uh, you can go to Indiegogo and search Josie and the Pussycats, and you'll find it right away.
Okay.
It's igg.me/@/Josie book,
Okay.
which Josie is Josie.
Yeah.
And then or you can go to josiebook.com, where I have a newsletter set up, and that doesn't like I have not updated that website since I set it up, so it doesn't have a link to the campaign, but when you sign up for the newsletter, the next thing you get a couple of days later will have a link to the campaign, because everything that I send out has a link to the campaign in it.
Sure.
But yeah, so that's, and then starting in May or so, once I have given the first draft to my editor, we're going to be available for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and stuff like that, because we're going to be publishing through Ingram Spark, which is essentially the Ingram book distributor's self-publishing arm.
Okay.
For all of the pre-orders, and that may disappear if somebody does buy the book, because again, I've had a couple of people who were interested in it. But in the time between when my first draft is done and when there's a final answer as to whether or not somebody else is going to have it, anything that we sell on Ingram Spark, those orders will be fulfilled on or by August 16th.
Awesome.
August 16th, we carved out as the release date for the book because it is the anniversary of the day the movie came out on VHS and DVD.
Very nice. Very good.
The actual 20th anniversary of Josie and the Pussycats is April 9th. That's when it came to theaters. And I am doing something. I still can't say what in specific, but if you follow me on Twitter, I'm going to have like a little event on April 9th that is going to be like a fun little celebration of the 20th anniversary of the movie. And also, I should say, just because
your Twitter handle. Don't forget
Russ,
to give your Twitter.
Yeah, Russ Burlingame, RussBurlingame.
Yes.
One thing is, if you're interested in this movie, or if you just think like this is a crazy person and it might be fun to watch him slowly descend into madness, either way, if you pre-order by March 21st, which is my birthday, it's a week from today, and I don't know if the show will be out by then, so this might be
I'll make sure it is.
But if you pre-order by March 21st, on April 9th, there's going to be a special like bonus perk, basically, that a buddy of mine and I are putting together. And I don't want to go into what it is exactly, because I feel like it's going to be a nice thing to just drop and be like, haha, cool digital goodies. But it's an idea that we had early on. We're like, oh, wouldn't it be fun to do this?
Yeah.
And it's coming along nicely. And I the only reason I put March 21st as the kind of cutoff date is because there's things that have to be prepped. And so I wanted the 2 weeks before the campaign ends and the 2 weeks before the anniversary to do all the prep. The campaign itself ends actually on April 11th. So the event that I do on April 9th for the 20th anniversary of the film's release will double as kind of the last big push that I do to get people to pre-order on the Indiegogo campaign.
Awesome. Russ, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me.
No, this is great. What I want to do is go ahead. I'm telling you in advance, after publication or right before, I want you back on and we're going to talk just more about the book. I have questions about who you didn't get to talk to. Was there anyone you wanted? What surprised you? So we're going to save all that.
Well, and we'll know more about that soon. I actually have one person in particular who there's a whole fun story to the pursuit of this interview, and it's still unknown how that story ends exactly.
All right, that sounds good. All right, thank you, Russ. I appreciate so much. Once again, Josie and the Pussycats. Go to Indiegogo, check it out. He's at Russ Burlingame on Twitter. From there, you can get the link. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. Please go support this program. Remember to wash your hands. Remember to social distance. Wear an F mask. Take care of yourself, and we will talk to you soon. Goodbye. Doing a podcast at times can be a one-way conversation, and I hate that. So please let me know what you like and don't like about the work I'm doing. You can reach the podcast via email at setlistingbruce@gmail.com. The show is on Twitter at setlistingbruce, and my personal Twitter is at jessejacksondfw. We have a website, www.setlistingbruce.com. From there, you can find links to other Springsteen podcasts as well as other music-themed podcasts. We have a page devoted to our own SLB All-Star Band. These are guests who have been on the podcast more than 3 times. There is a link to our store where you can purchase Set Listing Bruce shirts as well as a Mary Question t-shirt. There is a link to our Patreon page where you can sign up to help support the podcast financially. We have different levels and different rewards based on your support. If you don't have any extra cash, and right now who does, you can support the podcast by subscribing via your favorite podcast player and leaving us a review. The more reviews we have, the easier it is for people to find us. And please tell a friend about the podcast, especially if they love Bruce or music, because it will make a difference.
You just heard the fun talking, hard rocking, music loving, album ranking, fan thinking, joy spreading, lyric reading, story sharing podcast that is the one, the only Set Listing Bruce. Set Listing Bruce is part of the Southgate Media podcast group. The theme for Set Listing Bruce was written by David Rosen, used by permission.